Hello, and welcome to Sunday at Bear Branch, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. We are now rebroadcasting the morning sermon of Brother Brian Barrett, who preaches for our congregation here at Bear Branch in Spurlock, West Virginia. We hope that you will find the lessons profitable in the study of God's Word and enlightening to the Christian walk. Brother Barrett has been a preacher and teacher in the Churches of Christ for over 40 years, a frequent speaker in gospel meetings, revivals, having worked in TV and radio, and now our internet ministry. We now invite you to open your Bibles and follow along in our lesson of the hour. Now, here's Brian.
We want to continue in our discussion that we have been having about temptation in the Christian life and living faithfully within the things that God has called us to do. Christians must prepare their lives and they must put effort into considering the events of life itself, if we are to overcome temptation, if we're to make the right choices when temptation presents itself to us. We can't find the way of escape if we don't understand the lay of the land. And so we need to know which direction to go safely when difficulties arise. And we have discussed many different things along the way that pertain to Christian life, and we're going to look at many more as we go along. Really, the whole New Testament is teaching us and showing us how it is that we ought to live our lives before God. This morning we're going to be studying from 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to look at some of the things, the statements which are made there by Peter, trying to encourage us to live a life of faithfulness so that we can be the people that God has called us to be. Talking about Jesus in verse 1, Peter says, "For so much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that has suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin." When we look at this verse, we were studying in our Bible class this morning about whether or not Jesus came in the flesh, and John tells us that he did. The Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us. Here, Peter tells us the same thing, that Christ suffered for us in the flesh. He was in the flesh. He was human. He experienced temptations. He experienced difficulties. And likewise, we ought to arm ourselves with that same type of mindset that, in a way, we may have to suffer for the cause of Christ. That's what he's talking about here. Jesus suffered for us, and we need to prepare ourselves. We need to arm ourselves likewise with the idea that we're going to, as Christians, suffer for him. Suffering implies the fact that things are uncomfortable. Sin is generally the easiest path. It requires little thought, and we can generally just coast right along into whatever it is. It takes effort to steer yourself in a different direction, to fight the flow of things, sometimes to swim upstream, if that's what it requires, to go in the opposite direction of what the world's doing. But we need to do that so that we can have in our hearts and in our minds the determination to cease from sin. Jesus suffered in the flesh. He died, was buried, he rose again. Paul speaks of this in Romans, the 6th chapter. Sin has no more dominion over him in any capacity. It may have tempted him. He was tempted like as all in all points like as we are, yet without sin. But in his glorified body, he is freed from sin. And so Paul tells us in Romans 6, after we're buried with Christ in baptism, we have risen with him to walk in a newness of life. The old man of sin is destroyed, and we shouldn't from that point on be a servant of sin. We have been delivered from that. But as Peter says, that doesn't mean that we may not have to determine how much we're willing to suffer or not suffer. Notice it says here in verse 2 that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. What's your goal? What is our goal in life? You know, this is an issue that as Americans we really need to look at, because we have so much. You know, I have to admit, as I've said before, I didn't really appreciate as much what I had until I saw the way that many others live. You know, and we have many opportunities and we have many things, but sadly those opportunities sometimes lead us into sin, lead us into temptation, and obviously with stuff, the things that we have, the things that we possess, we either use them to the glory of God, or the devil will use them as an adversary and use them against us and cause us to be consumed in our time, in our money, in whatever it is. And so Peter all along has been trying to get us to think about how we're going to live our lives. And it's hard. It's hard as Christians not to buy in to all the stuff the world tells us. Get a good job, make lots of money, put lots of money in a 401k, get a good house, get a good car, get. And then, you know, we find ourselves basically living for the things of the flesh rather than living for the things of God. And so Peter tells us that we need to arm ourselves. You know, in verse 3 it says, "For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought or worked the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries." You know, Paul gives us lists along the way too of some of the things that we have been involved in prior to coming to Christ. He describes here the fact that rather than behaving as the people of God, Peter says we behaved as the nations or as the Gentiles. Now that's interesting because Peter is a Jew, and he's talking about, in some capacity, he is addressing the Jews and the dispersion going out from Jerusalem and the persecution and things. And so on one level, he's saying to the Jews, we lived our lives like the rest of the nations. Now, we know from our studies in the Old Testament on Wednesday evenings, when we were looking there, God wanted the Jews to be a peculiar people unto himself. He gave them special clothes. He told the men how to shave their beard. He told them about the fringes on their garments. He gave them certain dietary things that they were to observe, things that were clean, things that were unclean. He gave them all of these things in order to keep them a peculiar or special or unique person unto himself. But Peter says, you know what? We just live like everybody else. We just live like the rest of the Gentiles. That's the way we did it. God wanted us to be faithful to Him. God wanted us to be unique unto Him. But the way when we look at the history, we could pretty much say there wasn't a great deal of difference between the Jews and the Gentiles in the way that they carried out their lives. Because all throughout the Old Testament, God is not constantly saying, I am so happy with you, I am so happy with you, I am so happy with you. He was constantly sending prophets saying, I am so upset with you, I am so upset with you. You were my bride, you were set apart for me. And yet you go wandering out in all of these abominations and all of these things, acting as if you don't even know who I am. And that's a message that over and over repeats itself in one way or the other through the prophets in the Old Testament. And so Peter first addresses the Jews, and as we said before, he addresses the Jewish Christians and how their lives should have been separate and different, but they weren't. They walked in lasciviousness, the lusts of the flesh, the things that made them feel good, various temptations, all of those things. Some of the things that he talks about are lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life, all those kind of things that we read about in the Scriptures. Excess of wine. We keep over and over again, hearing the question, and I'm sure it was with Israel too, how much is excess? How much can I drink and still be, on the right side of the fence? And so people want to debate, and we still debate, and we still talk about, how much is not excess and how much is excess. Is it just privately at our dinner table when we drink a glass of wine or have a beer or whatever, or are we talking about social drinking, and where does all that go? We're wandering down the wrong path. Lasciviousness, lust, excessive wine, revelings, and that word, as best I can retranslate it today, would be partiers. Love to party. Party. And that incorporates many things. It incorporates really the rest of these. It incorporates lust. It incorporates excessive drinking, lasciviousness, fornication, adultery, all those other things. When we start drinking and carrying on and partying and those kind of things, it tends to get out of control. There's not a whole lot of difference in the revelings and the banquetings. Only many times the revelings, the partyings were influenced by alcohol and those kind of things. It was there also at the banquets, but dealing with the lust of the flesh, here in this sense, just eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and eating. And the Romans were, some of the people who would just eat, and it was a goal for them to just taste things and eat things, and they would fill up, throw up, and go back and start all over again. It's one thing when you're hungry to sit down and eat. It's another thing to graze all day long, in the sense that we're just constantly eating. That we're trying, to feed the things of the flesh. And it comes in many formats and various adulteries. In some places, even Paul says that lust itself, lusting for money and those kind of things, is in and of itself idolatry, making an idol out of something that we invest so much of our time, our money, and our efforts into. And then verse 4 adds to that another thing that we cannot miss in this discussion, and that is the discussion of peer pressure. Peter says, wherein they think it strange that you run not with them in the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. Once we make a break, once we make a decision, once we try to do better, once we become a Christian, there are things that we shouldn't be doing. And that's some of the things that Peter mentions here. Like I said, Paul mentions the lust of the flesh, the things there in Galatians, the 5th chapter, and there's many places where it's addressed. But one of the things that we have to arm ourselves with is, what are you going to do when your old friends want you to go with them? And you know what your old friends do when they're out. And so you have to, first of all, make a decision whether you're going to go with them or not. And since you know what they do, you can say, well, I can go with them and I don't have to do the same things that they do. And then when they start doing it and you don't, they think it's strange. What happened to you? What this change in you. You think you're holier than thou now. You think you're better than I am now. And so we get into the peer pressure. Teenagers especially suffer from peer pressure. And it's very difficult as a Christian and a teenager to endure many of the things that people expect you to do. Whether it's in school and various things that they're involved in, and the fruits of many of the things that they're into. And if you refrain from some of that, whether it's the language, the talking, the dress, the way we dress, the way that we talk. And I remind everybody again, in the Old Testament, you could recognize a Jew from a mile away. Their dress was different. Their attitude was different. Sit down to dinner, and it didn't take very long to tell that, you're not one of us. And so, as a Christian, should we strive to be like everybody else, look as close as the world, without, again, crossing the fence? Many times people allow peer pressure, even as Christians, to move them as close to the fence as they can get, because they don't want their associates to bring up the point that you don't go to the same excess anymore as we do, whatever that is. You don't dress the same way. You don't talk the same way. You don't act the same way. You won't go to the same places. You won't do the same things. What's wrong with you? All those things. Peter said you need to consider that. We all need to consider that. Because peer pressure is a very powerful thing. And the marketers on Wall Street and all of those have used it quite a bit over the years. One person saws a hole in their pants, and the next thing you know, everybody's got holes in their pants. And it goes further than that. And so, we know that peer pressure is there. We know the ugly duckling syndrome, and we don't want to be the one that stands out in the crowd. It's there. And we ought to be wise enough to realize that it does influence us. We make decisions based on that, what our friends think. We don't want to lose our friends. We don't want to get into an argument with our friends. And so we do that. But Peter reminds us, they will give an account to him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead. And the word quick there means living. Those who are alive at Christ's return and those who have passed on. God is ready. He has been ready for a very long time to judge the living and the dead. Peter tells us over in 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, the Lord is not slack concerning his promises, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And he says, but the day of the Lord will come. Now, he knows when that day is. I don't. I'm not going to try to guess, because it's going to come like a thief in the night. But there are many who are going to have to give an account. And we need to be careful about that, because God will judge the living and the dead. We're going to, I don't want to get into the whole discussion here. It's a theological discussion. It takes time. I'm not going to get into verse 6 and verse 7 specifically here, because that's it's not where we're at right now. We're going to go on over to verse 8. And so as it comes to our walk with the Lord, Peter says, above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. And of course, charity is the agape type love, the type of love that puts the welfare of others above our own, the thing that causes God to love us so much. He gave his only begotten Son, caused Christ to give his life on the cross of Calvary, all of those things. And Peter says, have fervent charity. The idea of not just practicing charity, but fervent charity. And that says, look for ways to express that love to yourselves and, as need be, to others as the opportunity presents itself. As I think about charity, there's a couple ways of viewing it. I think of it as passive charity. That is, when a situation presents itself to us and somebody says, hey, could you help me? We do. To me, that's kind of a passive charity, in the sense that, yes, we practice it, but it's sort of in a passive way. It's not an aggressive form of charity. An aggressive or fervent form of charity seeks out ways to show our love to one another and to those who are around us, who are our family members. You know, that it's kind of interesting, but I just want you to think for a little while. What would happen if over the next 30 days we all practiced aggressive, fervent charity among ourselves and the world? And by that I mean that all of a sudden, husbands, you'd be a whole lot better to your wife. And wives, you'd be a whole lot better to your husbands as far as charity is concerned. You know, to aggressively, fervently seek out opportunities and ways to show your love. As parents, to be very aggressive, fervent in showing true love to your children. And children being showing that love back to their parents and not arguing. You know, if you know that, you know, mom and dad expect you to do something, why don't for just a little while you just go ahead and do it before they even have a chance to tell you? What would the world be like if people would just understand their responsibilities, understand the needs of others, look to see that, and go out of their way to practice that? It could literally change the face of the world. Now, I don't expect everybody to do that. It would be nice, but the world is not going to understand that. But Peter says, as Christians, love covers a multitude of sins, literally. And so it can keep a lot from ever even happening. And sometimes, arguments, man, I was going to really let her have it, but, come home and, well, there, whatever it is, I just had to kind of calm down and settle down and, or I was going to let him have it. I stewed all day. But then when I come home, whatever it is, it can defuse situations. Love is a very powerful thing, and Peter says that, that we as Christians ought to be those who practice a fervent, and as I prefer the term aggressive, not aggressive in the sense that we just literally try to overpower each other, but looking for ways or opportunities to do that. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. Being hospitable to others, showing kindness to others without grudging those kind of things. Whether, of course, at that time, you never knew when you might get a knock on the door and someone say, we don't have anything to eat. We don't have this, we don't have that. And, people would say, well, I guess, and you come in, and then when they leave, you talk about them for the next week, how they had the nerve to do that. And that's not what Peter's talking about, but he says use hospitality without being grudging toward them. There are many parts of the world. America, as I said, we have many blessings that we sometimes forget about. I go to the grocery store and I watch that person in front of me that has a cart heaping over, paying for it with their EBT card. And I'm looking there because I have to take the little buggy. I don't take the big people's buggy. I take the little buggy because I don't want to have to pay for filling the big buggy up. And so sometimes I have, that idea, and some of us have of, some ill will. But, in many places in the world, people, they literally are begging in the streets for food. I don't want to see our country in such a predicament. And I know that there are children in our country that are hungry, and I know there are children that are homeless, and I know there are those kind of things. And I'm not, but there are other places in the world it's much more difficult than that. And so part of that fervent or aggressive form of charity is also showing hospitality. I read about historically, even in this area many years ago, a family would have 10 children, couldn't take care of them. And so another family would just take them in. There was no official adoption. There wasn't all the things that go with it today. It's just we took them in. We had some extra food. We were doing better. So, we took their kid in and we raised them and sent them to school and did all that kind of stuff just because we could. Of course, as time went on, that's changed again. The government wants to take care of everything for us. But these are things that we need to think of. Peter tells us here that, we need to arm ourselves with, an understanding of what we're willing to do. What kind of people are we? Where will we go? What will we do? Both the good and the bad. He's talked about some of the bad, but now he's asking us to look at what good will you do? Whether that's, whatever. And so whether it's, again, feeding the hungry. I know that there are many parents out there, and I'm sorry for their kids. I really feel sorry for them because they get funds to take care of their kids, but they don't use it the way it's supposed to be. And their kids are hungry when they shouldn't be, and the government says, well, we're taking care of them, but the government may be taking care of them, but their parents aren't. So there's just a lot of things going on, and so it's things that we, each of us have individual lives, different lives. We interact with people differently. We see things that other people don't see, and each one of us have to handle that ourselves. We can help one another and we can encourage one another, but we're still left ultimately to do all of this, between us and God. He says in verse 10, as every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whatever God places in our hands, He's given us the opportunity of stewardship. Not everyone has the same opportunity. I don't know how many times as a preacher I've talked about the parable of the talents. Not everybody has the same ability and given the same opportunities as others, but as we are given that gift and talent that we possess, minister to one another, help one another, care for one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. I don't know why everybody doesn't have the same thing. I don't know why God doesn't give everybody the same thing. I do believe that some of the reason is to see what those He gives more to do with it. Whether we're going to be the rich fool who's going to tear down the barns and build bigger barns, or whether we'll use that gift in some positive way to change the world or to change one person's life, to lift somebody up out of the misery of life and perhaps put them on a path or a direction that's going to keep them from losing their soul. As we look at these things, and we're going to kind of go into a different spot, so we're going to kind of stop in that today. But Peter tells us that we ought to arm ourselves. Big controversy in this present day is the purchasing of guns and having guns and all of those things. Well, people arm themselves for a reason. They do that to prepare themselves for events sometimes they don't necessarily want to happen, but if they happen, they want to be ready for them. I don't really expect to go and get drunk, but that doesn't mean that I believe that I can't get drunk, that there's not a possibility somewhere. I don't want a thief to break into my house. I never want that to happen. But we arm ourselves so that if even the unforeseen, the undesired happens, we're ready for that occasion. And that's what Peter's talking about here. Prepare yourselves for the things that sometimes we don't think can happen, we wouldn't want to happen, we've said won't happen, but just might anyway. We just never know. But we have to think ahead and we have to prepare in order to do that. If you're here today and you're not a child of God, before you is the opportunity, believing in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, to repent of your sin, confess your belief, be baptized into Christ, or as a child of God, not walking where you ought to be, doing the things that you need to be doing through repentance and prayer, we can find reconciliation. If you're here this morning in any way subject to the invitation, we would encourage you to come as together we sing.
In closing this evening, we wish to thank you again for spending your time in study with us. We hope the lesson has been uplifting and motivational. We encourage you to return again for our next lesson. Until then, may we invite you to visit our website. You will find many study opportunities. Our resource page has links to the Gospel Broadcasting Network, a 24/7 station with many great Christian programs and speakers. In Search of the Lord's Way, with Brother Phil Sanders. We have 2 links for Bibles and downloadable software. If you are looking to really expand your knowledge, perhaps you might like to try World Video Bible School, a college-level learning site free of charge. So, until next time, may God bless and keep you in His care as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the churches of Christ salute you.